Welcome to the show, Ian. Thank
Hi.
you so much for coming along. What we're trying to do here is improve public debate and discourse and show that you can disagree with someone without hating them. And sometimes it can
It's okay,
be...
Chloe, I don't hate you. From the start, I can say that I don't
thank
hate
gosh.
you.
Thank goodness. How do you think that public debate could be improved?
Well, at the moment, I think we do have quite a healthy public debate. I think more people are involved in the public debate than maybe were 10 or 20 years ago, and that's largely because of the internet. And I can remember when I was one of the first mover bloggers in the early 2000s, I was arguing that blogging gave ordinary people an outlet for their views. Whereas so Mrs. Miggins from 32 Acacia Avenue, in 1995, her only outlet for her views was writing to a local newspaper, and the local newspaper might publish or they might not. Well, of course, once blogging came along, she could set up a blog free of charge and promulgate her views. Now, she might not have a huge audience, but in her local area, she might be able to build a reasonable audience. Then, of course, Twitter came along, which again was a sort of enhancement of the democratization of the internet. Well, that's how it seemed at first. And I didn't really understand Twitter, first of all. And I thought, why would anyone want to know what I had for breakfast? Because that seemed to be what it was mainly about. But once I understood what it could be used for, then I sort of adopted it. But over the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, Twitter has become an absolute cesspit of debate. And although there are times when you think, well, that wouldn't have happened without Twitter, there are other times when you just despair and think, well, and you lose confidence in your fellow human beings sometimes, where you can say something completely innocuous and then you just get pounced upon by people. And there is a part of me that thinks if I wasn't doing the job that I do, I would actually quit Twitter altogether, which is very sad because it's a way that people can converse with you when you're in the public eye. I think a lot of major league celebrities people have found that they're much more open to interaction with people that they don't know than they thought they might be. And I love interacting with listeners, for example, and I love it when people disagree with me. I mean, I don't want people to agree with me all the time. How boring is that? But there are times when you just think this is awful, and I'll plead guilty to it myself sometimes. I will react instantly and then live to regret it. I'll say something that's maybe sort of 50% more aggressive than it really ought to be. So instead of saying twat now, I might say muppet, which in some ways is more insulting, I think. But,
it's still an insult, but it's a bit less of one.
Sometimes you do have to exercise a bit of self-control, and I fail in that quite a lot, I have to say. Quite a lot of people have said, you're this nice, urbane chap on LBC, but on Twitter you become a beast. And I've got to tone down the beast in me, I think.
I'm probably a little guilty of that too. It's hard when someone attacks you or your ideas in a nasty way. The reaction is, I've got to get back to them and tell them why they're wrong, or I've got to right this wrong. When in reality, I don't think anyone on Twitter is going to change their mind on much.
But it's when people think they can insert themselves into your mind and tell the world what you think or what
Absolutely.
you mean by that. I'm thinking, how dare you? But on the other hand, it's usually somebody who's got an anonymous Twitter name and they've got 4 followers, so they're probably operating from St. Petersburg or somewhere. So it is all about self-discipline, and sometimes I lack it.
Well, I try to keep off it sometimes for my mental health more than anything, because a lot of it is just negative. And I think in general people are nice. I like people. I like talking to people. And they're nicer in person than they would be on Twitter.
Yeah.
And so if you just block out Twitter for a little while, smell the roses, speak to the corner shop owner, it's a bit nicer.
I think that is true. But also what you often find is that people instantly regret what they've written about you. And because they think that you won't reply, or you may not even read it, they feel a freedom to say what they like. Whereas if you do reply, say, well, hang on a minute, say, I didn't mean you, or I didn't mean to be so aggressive. And I find that quite a lot on social media, where people will actually row back if you do take them on, or if you do respond to what they're saying. But it could be a full-time job. And I mean, I generally only do it when I'm on the train going home at night, because I've got nothing better to do. So if you want to have a row with me, between 10 and 11 p.m, on the train to Tunbridge, that is when to do it.
Well, there we are. There we are. Anyone direct your hate in those hours? No. Well, speaking of Twitter and changing positions on things, I have changed my mind on things in the past, shockingly. We're not just one set of ideas throughout our whole life. I think it's very healthy to be open to new ideas and new arguments. And I'm happy to go into a bit more of what I've changed my mind on, but I'm curious to hear about any examples of when you've had a very strong opinion on something and gone the other way, and why was it that you changed your mind on that topic?
How many hours have you got? Because I think people who are involved in politics in whatever form, people imagine that they have a rooted ideology which they stick to come what may. People accuse me of doing that on Brexit, for example. But in the 1980s, I was a member of the European movement, and I used to do debates for them. I remember in the 1983 general election campaign, when you obviously weren't even born, I was doing debates against Mark Seddon, who then went on to edit Tribune, who now works for the United Nations. And he was arguing as to why Labour's policy was right, that we should withdraw from the EEC as it was then. And I was arguing the exact opposite. No, the European community is a wonderful thing, blah, blah, blah. Whereas now I find that I've completely gone away from that, and I can easily justify that. But I mean, that's quite a journey. I think on social issues as well, I have undergone a bit of a journey where, and I think it's partly due to my radio show, when you're talking to normal people for 3 hours every day on particular issues, for example, benefits, bedroom tax, things like that, you can justify all the policies that the government comes up with in theory, but when you see how they're affecting people in real life, then you have to start to question them, because there's no point in having a policy that stacks up in political theory or social theory. It's got to work for ordinary people, because if you're in politics, surely you're in politics to improve the lives of normal people. But I find that many politicians will just want to stick to their ideology, to the policies that they've come up with, which they believe in, and they will ignore the empirical evidence that's staring them in the face. Bedroom tax is a good example of this, where when you get 3 middle-aged males ringing you up consecutively, saying how this was affecting them, and then actually almost bursting in, well, in fact, one did burst into tears and the other 2 were on the verge of it, then you think, well, there's something wrong here. And I think that most people would agree that whether it's housing that the public purse pays for or not, you should be able to have a spare room for family or friends to come and stay. I don't think that's a luxury particularly. Now, if they had said, well, if you've got 2 or 3 extra rooms, then I think you could make a case for that. But that's not what they've done. And when you have disabled people saying, well, I actually keep my oxygen bottles in the spare room and now I'm having to pay the price for that, you think, well, this is just a warped system. So on some issues like that, I've changed my mind. On abortion, I've changed my mind. I used to be down the line, pro-life, and my heart still is in many ways, but my head is telling me something very different. That if I stick to what I really believe in, that a life starts almost at the moment of conception, then I should consistently argue that abortion should be banned. But I know what would happen if abortion was banned. It would still go on, and it would go on in very unsafe circumstances. So if you want to protect women and you want to protect the unborn child in some ways, you've got to be pragmatic in some of these things and not just stick to an ideology. And I've had some terrible arguments on my show with women and men in Northern Ireland on this issue. And it's really, I mean, I can see where they're coming from on it, but they cannot understand that if they stick to their guns, there'll be a lot of women suffer. Well, some might die if they have an illegal abortion. So I've travelled a bit of a journey on that. If you try and be ideologically pure, you're not going to be a good politician because you don't understand the consequences of the laws that you'll either defend or want to enforce.
Absolutely. I think politics is often the pull between left-wing organisations, right-wing organisations, having a debate together, and then usually somewhere in the middle there is a solution to a problem. One issue that I have very recently changed my mind on, that I was very surprised that I changed my mind on this issue, is feminism and the history of women. I was always told when I was younger that I should be very lucky to live now, but that I was still very oppressed, that I should be a little bit resentful perhaps of men for having all this power throughout history, that I should worry about being discriminated against, that I should seek out cases and constantly be on guard in defending myself as a woman against this patriarchy. And the more I've read about it and the more that I've seen the evidence, I just don't think that's the case at all, actually. Not in my lived experience, but I think
not
that's...
even in Australia?
Not, well, no, I think there are definitely some assumptions about genders that restrict both genders. I don't like stereotypes. I don't like the idea that men might feel uncomfortable staying at home while the women work. So that's not the case in New Zealand with the New Zealand Prime Minister, female Prime Minister going to work and hubby staying at home. But I feel a bit resentful actually that I've been told this narrative, and I believe in some cases lied to, about things like the gender pay gap, which initially you think, oh, well, women are being paid less than men for the same work. But actually, it's a more complicated picture than that. And the pay gap is just the difference in averages of earnings. And it's about the same, men and women earn about the same up until 40. And then you do see this gap. And that's more often than not down to women choosing to have part-time work to raise families. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing if they are choosing that and don't feel forced into that situation. So I've really changed my views on feminism. I used to be very, proud feminist. Now I think maybe some modern aspects of feminism might be doing more damage than good. I also think that men sometimes are forgotten about, or men's issues aren't spoken about. There's a cost to saying there is a patriarchy, that men are privileged and men are not privileged. The cost to that is that we don't see people as individuals with their own trials and tribulations. We don't try to see society as a mix. I don't like that idea of pitching genders against each other.
Do you not think, though, that we still have a long way to go before there is proper equality of opportunity for women in some sectors of society or the economy? And we look at the City of London. I mean, they now have, I think, 25% of the FTSE 250 companies have female chief executives or chairwomen or whatever you want to call it. He says being very sexist. Now that is a lot better than it was a few years ago when it was 9%, but it's still nowhere near 50%. You look at so many different areas where there is no reason why women shouldn't be on a par with men, but the percentages just don't match up. I think the media is an area where things are actually almost going the other way now, where I know as a radio presenter, you've got little chance now, certainly of a BBC job, because they automatically seem to go to women. I mean, I'll never work for the BBC anyway, because they won't have anybody with my political or my past political views. So, but I look at some of these things with a certain wry smile when say, well, it's got to go to a woman. Well, I'm sorry, if they're about to name the new host of Question Time, and everyone assumes it will be a woman, and I'm pretty sure it will be. But if there was a man who was actually much better suited to that, surely the man should get the job. I mean, talent, particularly for a job like that, it doesn't actually matter whether you're a man or a woman. You can either do it or you can't. But I'm pretty sure that will go to a woman. I'm pretty sure the new main presenter of Newsnight will be a woman. You look at Radio 2, who've now got the breakfast and drive time show hosts as women. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but it almost seems to be they're making a point from a situation where they had no women daytime presenters on Radio 2. They've now got the 2 primetime shows. Now, okay, good on them in a sense for that. But sometimes it's going too far, this obsession that the BBC has with women's football. I'm going to say something controversial now.
Really?
I don't ever want to see a women's football match.
Really? Why is that?
Because it's boring. It's like you play a 45 single at 33 speed. It's just...
I haven't seen one, I can't comment.
Well,
Seen lots of men's football though, I don't mind it. It doesn't bother me that they're men.
No one's interested, and yet they're trying to make us interested in something that we're just not interested in.
That's what I take issue in, this idea that we have to...
This is going to be what comes out of this interview. That's what people are only going to concentrate on. I know. I have said it before. So.
Well, you made a good counter-argument to my assertion that maybe there isn't an issue with discrimination of women. I think there probably is. I think it's more difficult to identify than just looking at averages of salaries. I don't think you can just look at the averages of salaries and say there's definitely discrimination. I also don't think you can look at the differences in profession and say it's definitely discrimination. There are more female teachers than male teachers, I believe. I think,
always have been.
Yeah, and
I mean, if you're a male primary school teacher, you really are an oddity, and everyone assumes you must be gay.
Really?
Yeah, or paedophile, one or the other.
Yeah, well, I think it's great that kids have. I think kids should have role models of both genders.
I remember just on that. I can remember when I was a parliamentary candidate, to be back in 2004. I went on a visit to a primary school on the North Norfolk coast. And I was absolutely mobbed by all of the kids, not because I was a political candidate, it's because I was a bloke in the school. All the teachers were female. And I suspect that a lot of the kids didn't have fathers. Well, they obviously had fathers, but not in their lives. And literally, they would just come up to me and hug me. And it's very sweet, but it was quite shocking in a way, because that wouldn't have happened to a woman coming into the school. And I think it would be fantastic to encourage more men to be particularly primary school teachers. I always wanted to be a teacher. I trained to be a teacher, and I never did it because my life took on a different path, but I've always thought about going back to it. If you can go back to something that you've never actually done. But I really enjoyed teaching the younger kids because they wanted to learn. It was the 14 or 15-year-olds who just never wanted to learn that I had a problem with.
Interesting. Well, at 14, 15, I was a bit of a nerd and I was very keen to learn. Yes, and I was actually quite left-wing.
Were you?
I was. At that age, I was very developing my views, reading about history. I was always very sceptical of whoever was in charge of power. I think a lot of teenagers are. And so for me, the kind of left-wing message really spoke to me. It was about bringing power back to people. And then I think it was probably around 17-ish, I started to read things like The Rebel by Camus, about how actually I loved it. I was such a dork. Oh gosh, but it was about how
reading James Herbert horror stories.
I was a strange kid. I'm a strange adult.
Nothing changes.
Nothing changes. But it changed my mind. And he was very left wing, but he said that revolutions are bad for people.
I was never really good at anything. I was okay at most things at school, but I never excelled at anything apart from German. And you could only study German at my school if you're only good at French. But because we had a succession of really crap French teachers, they had to put an allocation from our French class into German. And I remember going home one day with a letter from the school offering the chance to do German. And my grandmother said to me, well, you should always take the opportunity, even if you give it up later, just see what it's like. And I was terrible at it. And then I went on a school exchange trip to Germany for 3 weeks and came back and came top of the class in the end of year exam. And my teacher thought I must have cheated because I was that bad. But I hadn't cheated. It was just somehow I'd assimilated things while I was there. And that's what started me off on the sort of German trail. But I then, of course, I'd given up French for my O-levels, as they were then, GCSEs now. So when I did my A-levels, I had to do, because I wanted to go and do German at university, and most people who do German do French as well. So I started doing the French A-level without having done the O-level, and we had to read a book by Camus. I can't even remember what it was now. What's his most famous book?
The Stranger.
Yeah,
it's very famous. Yeah.
And I couldn't do it.
The last 5 pages of that, the last ending speeches are magnificent, but you've got to read through a whole lot of...
I'm sure they are if you can read French. But
I didn't read it in French, I admit.
And so I then reverted back to doing the O-level. I was in the same class as my younger sister, which was bizarre. And she would always outdo me. If I got an A-, she would get an A. If I got an A, she would get an A star.
How annoying.
It was very annoying.
You're not bitter about it,
I'm not bitter or twisted, but I did get a B at the end of the year, and I did it in 1 year, whereas she got an A having done 2.
but I set out to study counterterrorism because it was an area of policy that I was just fascinated by. There was no logic for it, no career path. I was very interested. And I felt very strongly that people that want to do harm to this country or Australia or a country that I'm a citizen of should face very harsh penalties. Perhaps we should even, shoot to kill and that kind of stuff if they're really, really bad. And then I read about all the structures of human rights, international human rights, and also in the UK and how the law sees it. And actually I found that what makes our societies, Western societies, in my opinion, better and superior is that they do value human life. And we do have processes to judge people fairly with evidence. And I really softened my anger. It's a very human reaction to want to be angry and say, terrorists who kill us, we should show them no mercy or no due process. That's another thing I would say I'd change my mind on.
The common theme in our conversation so far is that it's heart versus head, in that I would happily kill anybody that has committed a terrorist offence. That's what my heart tells me. But my head tells me that if we do that, we are just as bad as they are. And there are so many areas, if you look at crime and punishment, where that's true, and it is particularly true in terrorist cases. I've had a lot of discussions on my show about all these people that go to Syria and whether they should be allowed to come back. And people say, well, just withdraw their passports, make them stateless. And well, there is international law, and if we ignore international law, then we stoop to their level in a way. And I mean, I don't particularly want them to come back to this country because who knows what they'll do. You look at Anjem Chowdhury, who was released from prison recently on a 5.5-year sentence, and he served 2.5 years of it. Well, in theory, that's outrageous. Well, not in theory, in practice, it's outrageous. But the law as we have it now has changed under the last Labour government, that it's statutory that you have to be let out after half your sentence if you have done nothing wrong, if you've displayed reasonable behaviour. Now, should we change the law on the basis of one individual? Well, you can argue for that, but you can't make it retrospective. I don't believe in retrospective legislation. You look at a lot of the arguments that were had in between 2000 and 2010 on the length of time suspected terrorists should be detained without charge. Again, most people will just take the very simplistic view, well, if they're terrorists, just lock them up. Well, you do actually have to prove that they've done something. I mean, you obviously have to lock people up on remand, but should it be 28 days? Should it be 42 days? Should it be 90 days? Should it be longer than that? That argument is still going on, and I think we've broadly got the balance right. You look at the stop and search powers, and going away from terrorism for a moment, but again if a particular community feels that they're being discriminated against, that the police are acting in a racist way, then don't be surprised if there are results from that. Mm-hmm. And with the level of knife crime in London at the moment, there are a lot of calls to revert back to the old system. Well, do that at your peril, I would say. And this is generally from people who haven't even looked at the statistics, where under the old system it's mainly people were stopped for suspected drug crimes rather than knife crimes. The number of people who were stopped after being suspected of carrying knives was actually very small, I think 8% of the total. So that there are a lot of issues here where you can jerk your knee all you like and you can sort of let your heart rule your head, but the long-term consequences of that, I think, can sometimes be quite substantial. And if we really get to the point of lowering ourselves to the level of the terrorist, then don't be surprised if we get more terror attacks from both sides.
I'd agree.
Let's disagree on something.
Yeah, should we find something to disagree on?
I might be very socially liberal, but on economics I'm as dry as dust.
Okay.
So, I think our taxation system is almost criminal at the moment. And that is something I would say I've been completely consistent on throughout my adult life. And I think also the fact that the private sector generally does things better than the public sector. There are some exceptions to that. And I would say privatisation is something where you and I might disagree on, in that I was a firm advocate of privatisation in the 1980s and still am to an extent. But unfortunately, some of the exponents of privatisation are its worst advocates. I mean, you look at some of the company. I mean, you look at Capita, G4S, companies like that. that I think are an absolute disgrace in the way that they've handled public sector contracts. And they have led to the point where most British people now think all of these things should be done by the state. And you can understand why, because the private sector has let the country down. You look at the energy privatisations, you look at water, well, less water, I would say, but certainly it's only comparatively recently that an element of competition has been introduced, because we've had a toothless regulator in the energy sector. I don't think many people would argue for British Airways to go back into the public sector, but the fact that people firmly believe that the railways would be better off in the public sector, I mean, it is the fault of the politicians who privatised the railways in the wrong way, but also the train companies that tried to make out they could do things for a price that they clearly couldn't. And then they can just walk away from the contracts and suffer no consequences. And then they're allowed to bid for new ones. I mean, that is outrageous. So I don't blame people who argue that the railway should be renationalised. They're usually by people younger than me, because they don't remember how awful British Rail was back in the 1980s. People imagine it was this golden age of railways, and it absolutely was not. But who is putting the case forward for the fact that we've got new trains on virtually every new line? That would not have happened had the private sector not been involved, because the state didn't have the money to do it.
Of course not. And often, you know, this we talk about the government building things, but the government doesn't have a national building company where they employ
don't give them
people
ideas.
who know how to do these things. They give these contracts out to private companies. I think one of the issues with distrust in private companies delivering public services is probably procurement, where you see some very large companies constantly getting contracts. Sometimes you wonder if there's any kind of corruption, or if it's just the fact that you have to be so big to be able to tender for these contracts. I think there's a lot to be said for making it easier for maybe SMEs, not in every delivery of service, but at least in some areas of the public sector. You could deliver these contracts to local businesses, smaller businesses, and allow the government to take a bit more risk, because then you'd have more competition.
Yeah. If you worked in a PFI hospital and you were a manager in that hospital, and a nurse on one of the wards said, "Oh, the light bulb's gone, we need to change the light bulb," what do you think you would normally do? You might go and buy a light bulb yourself and claim it on expenses. That was probably the easiest way to do it. But no, they have to get it done by the company that runs the PFI at a cost of £100 or £200. I mean,
it's ridiculous.
How is that allowed to happen? The other people I blame for this, and they have huge amount to blame for in most privatisations, are lawyers.
Really? Why is it the
absolutely.
lawyers' fault?
The lawyers are, in these privatisations, they're the scum of the earth. They charge £500 an hour for advice which is usually wrong, and they construct contracts that are so complicated that, of course, only lawyers can understand them. And then the politicians are the ones that get the blame for approving the contracts. To a certain extent, that's fair. I mean, why would you approve a contract that you didn't even understand? And that's where rail privatisation went wrong, because it was so damn complicated. And it was made complicated because they wanted to split the track from the train companies. And therefore, there were all sorts of contracts that had to be constructed. I mean, I dread to think what the bill was for that privatisation. And it's you replicate that over all the other privatisations. And basically, the lawyers have the politicians by the short and curlies. And they've exploited them to the extent that the taxpayer has been ripped off to an enormous extent.
We see that all the time, not just with contracts for private providers, but also any kind of contract. So purchasing items, for example, public sector officials tend to have a terrible track record of negotiating down a price, or maybe using the fact that it's a huge purchase, so can we have a discount please? You never see this in the public sector. They just don't have that business acumen.
Well, you look at the NHS. I know somebody that works in procurement in the NHS, and the stories that she tells me, well, if I had any hair, it would curl. Same within the Ministry of Defence. I mean, the money that is wasted in that department, it is criminal. It would never, people in the private sector would never stand for that, because it is all about the bottom line. It's about getting value for money for the shareholders. Now, in theory, we as taxpayers ought to be the shareholders here. But I'm afraid that doesn't really trickle down to people at the procurement level in these huge departments of state.
Well, if you see the state as this provider, as opposed to something you own as a taxpayer, I can see why you would see the world that way. You think, well, the state has an endless supply of money, the state's the provider, I can spend it however I see fit. I think there's a certain level of responsibility in a business when you know it's your own money, you're investing your own money or other people's money. I wonder why there is this disconnect where taxpayers are not seen as shareholders in the same way as shareholders for a business are seen by those business leaders.
I don't think it's just confined to the public sector. I was watching a documentary last night on the fall of the Royal Bank of Scotland and the excesses that the senior management, not just Fred Goodwin but others, displayed there, where they built a new headquarters outside Edinburgh. And Fred Goodwin thought he should build a private road for himself to the airport, which wasn't that far away, that only he would use. I mean, that's the sort of thing that you get that Kim Jong-un would do. And where I think people have lost faith in capitalism and where there is virtually nobody who's putting the case forward for capitalism now is because they see lots of examples of this. They see the guy who ran Persimmon Homes getting a £75 million bonus. Now, he says, well, that was in my contract, as if that's a justification for it. It is not a justification for it. How do you keep your workforce motivated if they get a bonus of £1,000 if they're lucky and the boss gets £75 million? I mean, there is no way that can be justified through any means. Now, you can say, well, it's a private sector company, they can do what the hell they like. But they will reap the rewards of that in the end, because everyone knows now that guy got 75 million. Apparently he's been ousted now. But would I want to buy a house built by Persimmon Homes nowadays? No, I would not.
Well, there's a big difference, isn't there, between being allowed to do something and having the right to do something, and that thing being a good thing to do.
The problem is that this is happening in all sorts of organisations now, not just FTSE 100 or 250 companies, but you see people earning sums of money that normal people cannot get their heads around. And this never used to be the case. And there needs to be a little bit of social responsibility here, I think. And okay, it's quite difficult. If you're offered £5 million, why would you turn it down, I suppose? Because they say, well, we have to offer these huge salaries because that's the market rate. Well, it is the market rate if you make it the market rate. And I just don't think it's tenable for people to believe in capitalism when they haven't got any capital themselves. And that's, I mean, you get back to the whole house building argument here. And I think we're in a very dangerous state at the moment where John McDonnell has been very clever in analysing what the problems are, that people feel that the system isn't working for them. And I think there is a lot in that. He's diagnosed the wrong solutions, it has to be said. But he's been able to articulate the problems in a way that I think most Conservatives have not. And although I don't really believe that this country would ever elect Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister and him as Chancellor, I don't think you can rule anything out in today's politics. And I mean, in a way, there are some Conservatives who think that would be a good thing because all politics is cyclical. And I grew up in the 70s when we had all of these terrible socialist economic policies, and I saw what it did to the country. But this is on a different scale. And if they really did get power and implemented the policies that they're threatening to, well, maybe a good dose of socialism is what this country needs. That's what some Conservative MPs think, because they think they would then automatically then be elected with a massive landslide afterwards. Well, be careful what you wish for, is what I would say.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think the thing with socialist regimes is that they start with a message of hope and wealth redistribution, and they play on people's jealousy of wealth and resentment, but then once they are in the system, they change the system to make sure that they can stay in power. I'm not sure how Cornwall would go in the UK system. I don't know. I can't conceive of how we could change the rules. I think there might be some restrictions on the press. He did that video saying change is coming. I just don't know, because you have this manifesto which seems rather reasonable for a left-wing socialist government, but we know that his views are a lot stronger. So I disagree with those Conservative MPs. I don't think it's worth the risk. And I don't think it's too late to make the argument for the other side, though. But I don't know many people making the argument from the other side. It's accepting the left-wing solutions to problems. It's the rhetoric around spending and spending.
It's partly because there aren't many Conservatives who can articulate what conservatism actually means anymore. I interviewed a cabinet minister recently who I better not name, and I said, well, what kind of Conservative are you? And the bollocks that this person then uttered had to be heard to be believed. And this was not on air, luckily for them. But they couldn't really define what kind of Conservative they were. And I thought, well, how can you be in the cabinet and not be able to do that?
Do you think that's because people with very strong views, who are very, very intelligent, might be put off by the two-party system and they're having to toe a party line?
I think it's partly that you're getting a lot of Conservative MPs elected now who actually aren't Conservatives.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would agree with that. Although there's no
ownership.
I don't think there's like ownership of what is and isn't a Conservative. But there's definitely, I don't think most Conservative MPs are my style of conservatism.
Look, all political parties, all successful political parties are Big Tent coalitions. So you can have the likes of, I don't know, Heidi Allen and John Redwood in the same party, or you ought to be able to. And where political parties go wrong, and this is where I think Labour's going wrong, is that they start to become a sect rather than the party. The Republicans have done that in America. And I used to be a down-the-line Republican supporter, but since about 2008, I wouldn't have been able to support any Republican candidate or presidential candidate because the Republican Party is now a quasi-religious sect. It's not a political party any longer. And I think both political parties here need to be very wary of that. The reason Blair and Thatcher and Reagan and Clinton did so well from a voting point of view was because they appealed to people outside their own areas. And does anyone really think that Corbyn appeals to so-called Worcester woman or sort of the middle class voters? And there will be somebody does, no doubt. Does anyone really think that Theresa May has a massive appeal to the kind of working class voters that put Margaret Thatcher into office? Now people will say, oh well, she got a huge working class support in the last election. That was because of Brexit.
I agree.
And her speech on the steps of Downing Street on her first day indicated that she did understand that that's where she needed to go, but there's been no domestic agenda since then, really, has there? It's all been dominated by Brexit, unlike this conversation, which is very refreshing.
Yes. Well, before we go into Brexit, I think maybe we cut it there. Iain, thank you so much for coming along and having a good chat with me. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.